Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, um, there's this expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like engineering.
Right. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It's incredibly binary. I mean, the bone is broken or it isn't. We inherently crave that kind of, visible, categorized certainty.
But then you step into the world of human psychology and neurodevelopment and trauma.
And the X-ray machine is utterly useless.
Completely useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's murky. It is not a jagged white line on a screen.
No, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. So welcome. Today we are unpacking the exact architecture of human vulnerability and resilience.
Yeah, we've got a massive stack of sources on the table for you today.
We really do. Decades of psychiatric research, historical public health data, and some really sharp sociological critiques. Our mission today is to dissect this thing called the risk and protective factor framework.
Right, and I know that sounds like dry academic jargon.
It totally does.
But this is the literal blueprint used every single day by ER doctors, pediatricians, child welfare agencies to make life-altering decisions about real people.
It's basically the dominant lens through which public health tries to answer this profound, almost philosophical question, right?
Yeah.
Like, why does one person break under immense pressure while another person facing the exact same horrific circumstances actually thrives?
Exactly.
So let's get right into it, because looking at these sources, this framework represents a massive shift. We're moving away from seeing mental health as this, mysterious lottery or a simple X causes Y disease model.
We're starting to understand it as a dynamic, measurable equation.
Right, but before we can understand who thrives and why, we have to talk about the language we use. Because the research suggests that most of us, including the media, use the term risk factor completely wrong.
Oh, the term is thrown around with alarming casualty today. I mean, to understand its true weight, you have to look at its origins, which, ironically, didn't start anywhere near psychiatry.
Wait, really? Where did it start?
You have to trace it back to 1948, to a massive cardiovascular epidemiology project called the Framingham Heart Study in Massachusetts.
Okay, so they were looking for the root cause of heart disease.
Well, they were looking for predictors. By the early 1960s, researchers analyzing that data started using the specific phrase risk factor to describe traits like high cholesterol.
Because high cholesterol reliably predicted future heart attacks.
Exactly. But cholesterol isn't a germ. It's not a singular cause in the traditional infectious disease sense. And psychiatry and developmental psychology eventually adopted this logic because mental disorders, much like heart disease, they rarely have one clean, singular, microscopic pathogen causing them.
Okay, that makes sense. But because risk factor became such a popular buzzword, clinicians and journalists started diagnosing people and writing headlines based on incredibly messy data, right?
Oh, absolutely. The field realized they were basically flying blind, grouping entirely different things under one umbrella term. So they had to create a strict rule book to stop the bleeding.
And that rule book arrived in 1997. A group of prominent researchers published this pivotal paper in the Archives of General Psychiatry titled Coming to Terms with the Terms of Risk.
Yeah. Their goal was to clean up this sloppy usage and propose a strict taxonomy to differentiate mere correlation from actual causation.
Because fighting over definitions in medicine isn't just semantics.
No, it dictates how we spend billions of dollars in treatment.
So looking at their taxonomy, they broke this down into three distinct buckets. First, you have a correlate. And a correlate is just something that happens to be associated with an outcome at the exact same point in time.
Yes, just an association. Then they defined a marker.
A marker.
A marker is something that precedes the outcome chronologically, but it cannot be manipulated or changed by a doctor. So biological sex is a classic example. Being born male might predict a statistically higher rate of a certain behavioral outcome later in life.
Right.
But you can't go back in time and change that initial biological marker to alter the probability.
And finally, the holy grail for doctors, the causal risk factor. This is something that precedes the outcome, and crucially, if you change it, you actually alter the probability of the outcome happening.
Exactly. The sources use childhood poverty as a prime example here.
Yeah, poverty heavily predicts childhood behavioral problems, but proving it is a causal risk factor.
Proving the lack of money is causing the behavior, rather than both just being the downstream result of, say, severe untreated parental mental illness.
Right, that requires intense evidence. You need natural experiments, like a government cash transfer program, to see if simply giving the family money mathematically lowers the behavioral problems in the kids.
If the intervention changes the outcome, you've found a causal risk factor. If it doesn't, you haven't.
Okay, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. So a marker is essentially a dark cloud. It tells you rain is coming, but standing in your yard yelling at the cloud or trying to push it away won't keep you dry.
I like that.
But a causal risk factor is like a hole in your roof. Patching that hole actually stops you from getting wet inside your house. Are we basically running around confusing clouds for holes in the roof?
We constantly confuse clouds for holes in the roof, and when a city or a hospital designs public policy or interventions around clouds, they waste an incredible amount of time, funding, and resources.
Meanwhile, the people inside the house are still getting soaked.
That's silly.
So how did the scientific community figure out how this plays out in children? Because if we look at the origins of studying these factors in kids, it seems like the initial assumption was that some children were just born as magical superheroes.
Yeah, the literature literally used the word invulnerable.
Which sounds completely wild. We need to talk about how the scientific community had to aggressively walk back that superhero theory.
The turning point really happens in the late 1960s and 70s. A researcher named Sir Michael Rudder conducted a massive study on the Isle of Wight and later compared that data to inner-city London.
Okay, what was he looking for?
Well, Rudder built a 6-item index of family adversity to see what predicted childhood psychiatric issues. He tracked variables like severe marital discord, maternal psychiatric disorder, and physical overcrowding in the home.
Well, let's pause on overcrowding for a second. We hear that and think, okay, a small apartment. But how does that actually impact neurodevelopment?
The mechanism is chronic biological stress. When a child has no quiet space, no privacy, and their sleep is constantly interrupted by noise or other people.
Their nervous system stays in a state of hypervigilance.
Yes. Their baseline cortisol, the stress hormone, is constantly elevated. Over time, that structural stress literally alters how their developing brain wires itself for emotional regulation.
Wow. So Rudder is tracking these heavy stressors. But right around that same time, you have this other study happening at the University of Minnesota, Project Confidence, which was looking at kids with a very specific, intense adversity.
The Minnesota researchers were studying children raised by parents with severe schizophrenia. Having a parent with schizophrenia is a highly robust predictor of later psychopathology, meaning severe mental illness patterns for the child.
But the lead researcher noticed something completely counterintuitive in the data, right?
Yeah, a substantial share of these children showed no elevated symptoms at all. They were thriving academically and socially. He wanted to know why, and initially he labeled them invulnerable children.
But they had to scrap that term quickly. Because invulnerable implies this fixed, magical immunity, like the kid is walking around with an invisible titanium force field.
It implies a permanent trait. But longitudinal follow-ups, tracking these same kids over decades, shattered the myth of invulnerability.
What happened as they got older?
Well, a child who looked perfectly fine and invulnerable at age 10 would sometimes completely crash and experience severe depression at age 20 when they left home. Or researchers would observe a child who is highly resilient academically, pulling straight A's, but simultaneously suffering deeply in their emotional relationships.
So the field realized this isn't a superhero trait bolted onto lucky kids. It's highly dynamic, and it's domain-specific.
Which explains the shift from invulnerable to resilient.
And that brings us to a 2001 paper in our sources, which has just a fantastic title, Ordinary Magic. The premise here completely reframes what resilience actually is.
The argument presented in Ordinary Magic is that resilience is not a rare, exceptional trait. It is simply the product of ordinary, everyday human systems operating normally under difficult conditions.
So we're talking about having a cognitively functioning brain, a working school environment, or simply having a secure attachment to just one caring adult.
Exactly, just ordinary systems.
I have to push back on this a little bit, though. If resilience is just ordinary magic, does that mean society is overcomplicating prevention? Like, should we stop hunting for these extraordinary, complex medical interventions and just focus our tax dollars on making sure a kid has a working school and one nice adult to talk to?
It is a vital question. In many ways, yes, this research shifted prevention science away from hunting for extraordinary heroes and towards strengthening those basic, ordinary protective systems for the general population.
So there's a catch.
A big one. The harsh reality is that maintaining those ordinary systems, keeping a school functioning safely, ensuring a parent has the mental bandwidth to be that caring adult under the crushing weight of extreme poverty or community violence is incredibly difficult.
Right. Taking that Jenga analogy from earlier, wait, we didn't use the Jenga analogy yet. Let's use one now.
Yeah.
Because the sources highlight that the math of how risk behaves doesn't just add up cleanly, it multiplies.
Hmm.
So think of human psychology like a game of Jenga.
The foundational rule here is that outcomes are probabilistic, not deterministic. Having a risk factor shift the odds against you, it doesn't guarantee a ruinous outcome.
Okay, so it's about shifting odds.
Right. But the second rule is about how these risks compound. The historical data showed a fascinating pattern. If a child was exposed to 0 or 1 risk factor, say just overcrowding, their rate of developing a psychiatric disorder was barely above the baseline of the general population.
So they pulled one block out of the Jenga tower. The tower wobbles maybe, but it holds fine.
But as the simultaneous risks climbed to 4 or more, the disorder rate didn't just inch up incrementally, it jumped non-linearly. It was a steep, massive spike that simple addition could not predict.
You pull 4 blocks out of the Jenga tower at the exact same time, and the whole foundation gives way instantly.
And the most famous, undeniable demonstration of this structural collapse is the 1998 ACE study. 2 researchers surveyed over 17,000 adult patients at an HMO in San Diego.
17,000. That is a huge sample.
Massive. And they tracked adverse childhood experiences, things like physical abuse, household substance abuse, or having an incarcerated parent. And they mapped a flawless dose-response curve.
The numbers in this study are absolutely staggering. For you listening, think about the invisible stressors people carry. If someone has 4 or more of these adverse experiences, they're looking at a roughly 4-fold increase in the odds of adult depression.
Yes!
And a 10-fold plus increase in the odds of a suicide attempt compared to someone with 0 ACEs, 10 times the risk.
The data is so compelling that it changed modern medical practice. California, for example, launched an initiative in 2020 that actually trains and reimburses pediatricians to screen every single child for these exact exposures during routine checkups.
Wow.
But we also have to recognize that it's not just the number of blocks you pull out, it's when those blocks are pulled.
Ah, timing and duration.
Exactly. Timing alters the math. A mother experiencing severe depression during a child's first 2 years of life, which is the critical window when core emotional attachment systems are forming, hits the child's neurodevelopment very differently than if that same depression occurs when the child is 15.
So we've seen how risk piles up to collapse the tower. Let's look at the other side of the equation. How do protective factors actually hold the structure together? Because it turns out protection in this field doesn't just mean the opposite of risk.
We often fall into that trap. We think if unemployment is a risk factor, then employment must be the protective factor.
Right.
But the psychological mechanisms are much more intricate. By the mid-1980s, researchers had outlined 3 distinct models for how protective factors operate in the human brain.
Let's break these down, starting with the compensatory model.
So the compensatory model is something that simply adds a positive counterweight for everyone, regardless of their background risk level. Later, researchers started calling these promotive factors because they promote health universally.
Like what?
A strong community recreation program, for instance, benefits all kids.
Got it. A rising tide lifts all boats. But the second model operates differently. The strict protective or moderator model. This is a factor that only shows its benefit under conditions of high adversity.
Right. A factor that does absolutely nothing statistically detectable for kids in safe, low-risk environments, but sharply buffers and saves kids in high-risk environments.
It functions exactly like a car airbag. I mean, an airbag does absolutely nothing for you when you're just driving down the street safely.
Yeah, you don't even know it's there.
But the second you hit a wall, the moment you enter high risk, it deploys and saves your life.
Taking that airbag analogy further, the third model is where things get truly fascinating, the challenge model.
Okay.
This is the idea that moderate, manageable risk itself actually builds coping skills. It's known in the literature as the stealing effect.
The scaling effect.
Yeah. A small, survivable dose of adversity acts like a vaccine. It inoculates a child, forcing their emotional immune system to build resilience against future stress.
To see these airbags and stealing effects in action, the sources point to this legendary piece of research, the 1955 Kauai longitudinal study. Researchers followed basically every single child born on the Hawaiian island of Kauai that year, nearly 700 kids from the day they were born into their 40s.
It remains an incredibly rich data set. About a third of those children were classified as high risk. they were born into poverty, troubled homes, or suffered perinatal complications.
And just to clarify for everyone, perinatal complications mean physical traumas right around the time of birth, like oxygen deprivation or low birth weight, which usually flag high developmental risk.
Correct. But the researchers found that about a third of that high-risk group defied the odds and grew into highly competent, well-adjusted adults.
And the data pinpointed exactly what the airbags were for these specific kids.
It was a combination of things: having an inherently easy infant temperament, finding at least one unconditionally supportive adult, leaning on external support systems like a church or youth group, and as they matured, developing a strong internal locus of control.
Meaning a deep-seated psychological belief that they actually held the steering wheel of their own life rather than being a passive victim of their circumstances.
Yes, but here is where the framework gets completely upended.
Yeah.
We have to introduce the concept of differential susceptibility.
The orchid and the dandelion. I love this theory.
It changes everything. Proposed by developmental psychologists, the theory suggests that there are certain biological and genetic traits, like a highly reactive stress response system, that clinical manuals typically label purely as vulnerabilities.
Okay.
In a harsh, high-adversity environment, a child with this highly sensitive trait will wither rapidly. They are an orchid.
But a dandelion child will be fine. I mean, dandelions can grow in the cracks of a concrete sidewalk.
Yeah.
They're sturdy, less sensitive, and resilient almost anywhere.
But here's the counterintuitive breakthrough. That exact same highly reactive orchid child, the one with the supposed clinical risk factor,
Right.
if you take them and put them in an especially good, highly supportive environment, they won't just do okay, they will flourish. In fact, the data shows they will flourish significantly more, achieving higher cognitive and social outcomes than the sturdy dandelion children do in that exact same good environment.
Wait, I need to make sure I am grasping the magnitude of this.
Hmm.
Are you saying a trait that we might officially label on a medical chart as a risk factor for anxiety is actually a bonus multiplier if you just move that person into a supportive environment?
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean our entire medical concept of vulnerability is half wrong?
It completely flips the paradigm. It means that labeling a trait purely as a vulnerability without asking what specific environment that trait will ultimately sit in is fundamentally misleading. Profound vulnerability and the potential for immense, exceptional thriving are often just two sides of the exact same underlying biological sensitivity.
That is mind-blowing. But with all these incredibly delicate nuances, ceiling effects, orchids, dandelions, airbags, it seems dangerously easy to get this wrong when you apply it to the real world. Let's look at what happens when institutions misapply this framework, because the sources document some massive failures.
The most glaring historical failure is the DARE program.
Drug abuse resistance education.
Hmm.
Started in Los Angeles in the 1980s. Anyone who grew up in the 90s remembers the black T-shirts with the red lettering.
Oh, yeah. It became the most widely used school-based drug prevention program in American history. And on paper, it was built on a very plausible application of risk and protective logic. If peer pressure is the primary risk factor for drug use, then explicitly teaching kids resistance skills in a classroom should act as the protective factor.
It sounds totally logical.
But rigorous long-term evaluations repeatedly found that the original DARE curriculum produced little to no lasting reduction in drug use. More concerningly, studies suggested it sometimes caused boomerang effects.
A boomerang effect.
Yeah. By bringing police officers in to explicitly detail different types of drugs and how to use them, they accidentally demystified the drugs. For certain populations of teenagers, this normalized the behavior and actually sparked a rebellious curiosity.
Oh, wow.
It is the field's ultimate cautionary tale. Plausible theory does not equal effective prevention.
And we see these exact same cautionary tales in biology. The sources spend a lot of time on the massive gene-by-environment controversy.
The 5-HTTL-PR debate. In 2003, a landmark paper was published claiming they had found the genetic mechanism for depression. They looked at a variant of the serotonin transporter gene. Genes come with alleles, which you can think of like volume dials.
Okay, volume dials.
They claimed that people with the short allele, a more sensitive volume dial, who also faced significant life stress, were far more likely to become depressed than people with the long allele facing the identical stress.
It was the poster child for how genes and the environment interact. It was in every textbook.
But then, in 2009, a massive meta-analysis pooled decades of studies together and utterly failed to replicate that interaction effect. The short allele didn't reliably predict depression under stress across larger populations.
So the initial finding just fell apart.
It triggered a massive, still unresolved debate about how incredibly cautious we need to be before we declare a specific biological marker a definitive risk factor.
And reading through these sociological critiques, it is not just biological caution we need. There is a huge structural caution here. Sociologists warn that using these risk factor checklists can quietly psychologize structural policy failures.
The critique is that when you focus entirely on scanning individuals or families with a checklist of risks, you implicitly blame the individual for outcomes that are actually rooted in massive structural failures, like systemic poverty, racism, or lack of affordable housing.
So it shifts the blame.
Right. It fuels surveillance-heavy interventions like child welfare algorithms that disproportionately flag minority families as high risk without actually providing any resources to reduce harm.
Wait, so governments are using this scientific framework to build algorithms that basically blame an individual's risk factors when we should really be blaming the societal system. It feels like we were blaming a fish for getting sick instead of testing the toxic water they're forced to swim in.
That is precisely the warning. You cannot fix toxic water by putting the fish in a therapy program. And we are seeing this exact tension play out right now in the current cultural debate over youth mental health.
You mean the entire debate around smartphones? The Surgeon General's advisory and Jonathan Haidt's recent claims that smartphones and social media are the primary cause of the adolescent depression epidemic.
Structurally, this is the exact same argument that researchers were trying to discipline back in the 90s. The scientific community is currently fighting over this question. Is social media a genuine causal risk factor?
Meaning if we physically take the phones away, the depression rates will actually drop.
Exactly. Or is social media usage just a correlate, a dark cloud that happens at the same time as, or is downstream of, other societal issues like lack of unsupervised play or economic anxiety that we just find very easy and convenient to blame?
We're right back to the clouds and the hole in the roof. We're trying to figure out if the smartphone is the rain cloud or if it's the actual hole in the roof.
The underlying framework hasn't changed at all, just the variable we are passionately arguing about.
So what does this all mean for you listening? If you take away anything from this stack of sources, it's that mental health and human development operate on a probabilistic, transactional model. Risk compounds exponentially. Remember the Jenga tower? You can only pull so many blocks before the foundation shatters.
And resilience isn't a magical superhero cape, it's just ordinary systems doing their job under intense pressure.
And most importantly, your specific vulnerabilities, your orchid sensitivities, might just be your greatest strengths if you can find the right environment to plant them in.
It offers a much more hopeful, dynamic, and actionable way of looking at human development.
It really does. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Think back to the challenge model we discussed, this scientifically proven idea that a moderate dose of adversity acts as an inoculation, a stealing effect that actually builds your coping mechanisms for later in life.
Yeah.
So look at modern society. Think about your own daily routine. We spend so much energy trying to perfectly curate our lives. We bubble wrap ourselves, and especially our kids, to avoid all stress, all failure, all discomfort. By constantly trying to eliminate every single correlate of risk, are we accidentally depriving ourselves of the very stealing effect we will desperately need to survive the major, unavoidable crises of adulthood?
That's a profound question.
We want the precision of a medical x-ray to show us exactly what's broken so we can fix it. But in our rush to patch every tiny crack, we might just be keeping our own foundation from ever setting. Something to think about next time you try to avoid a little rain. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.